But even in the US context, our immigration policy has been exclusionary, it has been punitive, it has been harmful for the intention of discouraging future migration. But as it relates to Central Americans, we have never recognized Central Americans as refugees in the US. So they're arriving as undocumented people, as we said, before the show, like categorized as illegals.
The CJ Knows Show.
Wow, what an awesome day. I can't wait for this show, Henry. This is going to be amazing. I mean, just a brilliant lady, a doctor, Dr. Canizales. Why don't you tell everybody about her? Huh?
Well, Dr. Stephanie Canizales is a researcher and author and a professor from the University of California, Berkeley. She's also the faculty director of the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, which just rolls right off the tongue there.
Yeah,
She earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Southern California. She specializes in the study of international migration and immigrant integration, with particular interest in the experiences of Latin American migrants in the U.S. Now, she's focused her work in her latest book on the migration, the coming age of unaccompanied children from Central America and Mexico into Los Angeles, California. And she's also had her work published and research reviewed in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, among other outlets. She also informs policy through her work as a resident scholar with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and a research consultant at UNICEF. So,
well, a lot of
quite a
yeah,
resume there.
Right, and she's probably going to run for office soon. Hopefully, maybe we can get her, convince her after the show. Listen, thank you for being
You'll have
here.
to work hard to convince me of that.
Yeah, well, we need bright young Latinos and Latinas to run and change the world, and part of that comes from education. You know, I like the fact that you study this topic, very apropos for what's going on politically today in our country. And immigration, you know, I love immigrants. I love immigration. It's what made this country. But it's a different dynamic today than we've seen in the past. So I thank you for being on the show. And, you know, I want to start out by saying one of my favorite songs from years ago was a group, I think they're out from your part of the world, the left coast, and they were singing, No soy de aquí, no soy de allá. I'm not from here, I'm not from there. That we have a generation of young people that sort of feel displaced. And I'm curious to that comment and tell me a little bit of what you found in your research. And I see you have that book, Sin Padres ni Papeles, I guess, with parents and without, with what is that? With parents, without parents, and
without parents nor papers. Yeah.
Right.
Sin Padres ni Papeles translates directly to without parents nor papers. So in thinking about that sort of not here, not there, I came to this work interested in the undocumented youth coming of age experience.
Right.
I was pretty active in the DACA movement and organizing around DACA applications and getting everything sort of off the ground in 2012.
Awesome.
I had sort of come into the work with Dreamer youth, so youth that were organizing around the DREAM Act and identified with that sort of very specific youth identity. And then I came across a group in 2012 of undocumented and unaccompanied youth workers in Los Angeles. So they were neither the exploited adult worker, and they were not the college-going, high-achieving, organizing young person. So I tried to tell this story, or I do tell a story in Sin Padres ni Papeles about how not having parents, not having legal status creates this condition where young people are vulnerable, not just materially, but emotionally, as they navigate those sort of mixed identities, right? We think about undocumented youth, even if they are without legal status or vulnerable in various ways, at least they have their parents or they have a household sort of coming to rally with them, right?
I'm fascinated that your parents are from El Salvador. I know you're born and raised in the States in LA, but you have that Latina background. And I have friends that work in El Salvador. Matter of fact, one of the guys that was involved with crypto stuff, a good friend of mine with Bukeke over there, and what they've done with the gangs. In a way, if you think about it, these marginalized children that come that don't feel they're from one place or another. Sometimes on the streets, pick up, becoming gang members, getting into crime and whatever, and then they've been shipped back to El Salvador. And a lot of the problems we see in El Salvador today and are over Central and Latin America and South America is directly from our policies here. Would you agree with that comment I made, or from what you've seen in your investigation?
Yeah, especially in the displacement of youth and the young people that I study in this book, we know that violence is rampant in modern day El Salvador or the rest of Central America, but that is
Right.
not inherent to the region or the people. As you mentioned, the gangs were imported. They started in Los Angeles among youth who were being targeted by Korean gangs or Mexican gangs in the surrounding neighborhoods. So these young people started to organize themselves, forming protective cliques in LA that became then organized gangs as young people were being deported and contained in various detention centers or facilities. But broadly, the history of Central American migration is one of US intervention economically, politically, one of even today, environmental degradation that is causing high rates of displacement, but it is US corporations or corporations that are partnered with US industries that are moving into Central America and displacing people simply by deteriorating or degrading the soil or contaminating water supply. We're all experiencing the effects of environmental crisis, but people in the global South much more than in the global North. So yeah, it is all sort of directly tied to this history of US
So
intervention.
if I understand, you really believe that the United States policy to Central America, let's leave it with that, has caused the conditions back when my dad worked in El Salvador and Nicaragua, those policies of the 80s and the late 70s, early 80s are affecting what affects migration today into our country. Is that pretty much
Absolutely.
what you're saying?
Yes, and in the book, I do trace in Sin Padres Sin Papeles, I do sort of trace from the 1940s and 50s on into, COVID times, right? But when you create economic, political, social instability, or even infrastructure, like physical infrastructure instability, you get crisis after crisis that hits these
Yeah,
countries,
yeah.
and then they're displaced. But even in the US context, our immigration policy has been exclusionary, it has been punitive, it has been harmful for the intention of discouraging future migration. But as it relates to Central Americans, we have never recognized Central Americans as refugees in the US. So they're arriving as undocumented people, as we said, before the show, like categorized as illegal, right?
Right,
And
right.
treated as such as a threat in the US context.
I
But it's
don't
policy that
think,
makes it
yeah,
such.
I don't think they're illegal. Anybody's,
Right.
I'm a criminal attorney as well as personal injury attorney. But, my experience is when you are arrested or detained in immigration, you don't have a right to an attorney. And
Right.
and they spend months, years in incarceration, but they don't have a right to a lawyer because they're not criminals. And
Right.
that's and when you label them illegally, you're dehumanizing them. You're letting the ignorant
Absolutely.
Midwesterner say, "Oh, they're criminals. We can step on them and abuse them because they're criminals." And I think it's just heinous that anybody would call an undocumented person illegal, any human
Right.
being, and claim to be
Absolutely.
Christians at the very least. I don't think they're
Right.
very.
I always tell people, like, if you roll through a stop sign, that is illegal. Does that make you then an illegal? Right? Like, we do things we jaywalk, right? Like, there's all these things that we do that are against the law. But as you're saying, they're not categorized as criminals within the federal or the US nation state. So we get sort of mixed up in the terminology, but by
Well,
claiming that someone is illegal, what we do is create that social distinction where when they're treated poorly or when they're, experiencing suffering, we're like, well, that's what they get for
Well,
being.
I think we're hypocritical if we're, I divide if you're claimed to be a good Christian, a good person of faith, and then people are coming because they're hungry, they want a better life. How do you step on them? How do you treat them less because you were born here and they're across the border? I find it very fascinating. There's some studies and shows. I think Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico are right together. And on one side, in the United States, it's, you know, incredible birth rate, great opportunity. On the other side, it's disaster and crime and horrid.
Mhm.
Same people, same culture, but it's a system that was started way back. To me, it goes back to the Spaniards, and we see this dynamic of, and then of course I agree with you, the U.S. and the West coming in and abusing and using for, you know, pineapples and fruit and everything else.
Sugarcane, yeah,
Sugar
bananas,
cane,
all of it,
exactly,
yeah.
banana, right? Because I've seen that in Honduras. I've been personally there to see that, and then we create this dynamic that our ignorant population is not understanding why people are now leaving their homes. And I always say, who wants to leave their home, their family, the people that I always say they lose their alma, their soul when they come here. They're not,
Yeah.
it's not the American dream per se. It's that they have to make the move for their children. And we don't put in place anything to check that we're getting decent people. I don't mean rich people. I mean, you know, violent criminals and et cetera, and then create a safety net to help to make sure that they don't fall into the gang violence that you've seen in the Los Angeles area. Then they're deported back and create another problem, and the cycle starts up again, right? I don't know. It's fascinating to me that you've written this book and you have an interest in this subject. What are you trying to do to get the word out to people? I mean, obviously.
Well, let me jump in as the voice of ignorance here for a little bit.
I love the voice
because
of
you
ignorance.
touched on it, and for people that aren't living this and they don't see it in their daily lives, tell us what the daily life is of these young people before they come. How, and then what do they do? How did they just walk?
It's too
how
much
does
of
this
a practical
happen?
question. My God, that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So prior to migration, right? That's your question, what their daily lives were like. One of the things that I try to make very clear very early on in the book is that young people grow up as undocumented, unaccompanied youth workers in Los Angeles, where I did my research, in part because they were growing up as youth workers in their origin countries. So because of the instability that we were talking about a few minutes ago, we have intergenerational poverty in Central America, where children are experiencing a childhood, in Central America and Mexico, actually. Children are experiencing a childhood that is very different from childhood the way we sort of idealize it here in the US context, right? In the book, I talk about one young person who was shining shoes at the age of 3 years old and had like an assigned corner in his family. Young people that were going to the market and selling goods, or sewing Adidas track jackets in their living rooms, right? At the age of 9 or 10, kids working in fields alongside their parents or older siblings. So they're growing up.
I'm sorry, how did they wind up sewing Adidas jackets in their home? How does that get contracted out?
Yeah, so it makes Adidas more money, and watch me catch a lawsuit. It makes these companies more money to have products produced elsewhere, right? And then
Well, they're not.
shipped in.
They're going to protect themselves by contracting to somebody who does this, who does that. It
Right,
creates
right, right.
of separation.
Someone
Layers of
approaches the parent
separation. Mhm.
Yes.
and asks for
So
the labor of their child?
there are factories throughout Central America, and you will see made in Guatemala. It doesn't say where in Guatemala. Maybe it was someone's living room, maybe it was in a factory. But my understanding is that there are sort of factory jobs that then some tasks can be taken home. And then children will get in on the work of their parents, or children will find that work themselves.
Well, the parents have to do this for survival.
It's like giving them a hobby.
Well, come on, Henry. Back in the day in the United States, if you talk to my dad, who's deceased, I mean, you had kids so that you could work the fields. You could, you had.
Well, there's a movement in the country to roll back child labor laws here. So I'm trying to.
Over 30 states have rolled back child labor laws.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Or
There you go.
attempted to start the movement. Yeah.
Well, money is important for the higher ups, and I think that one of the big problems in Latin and Central America and Latin America in general is that I know that in like the early 1900s we had 28,000 or so banks lending and helping the average person. In Mexico, for example, there was like 45 or 42 banks. Two of them controlled 60% of the wealth. The banks are there for the wealthy, for the people from the right family. Across Latin America, I'm in Colombia a lot, I see that. If you're not from that family, forget it. you're not going to get opportunities. You're not going to get banking. That's why we see movements like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua or Chavez's or Fidel, is that it's the governments we've supported, like Somoza in Nicaragua. I know, there were anti-communist governments. We didn't care what they do to their people or if they gave opportunity to the people. And so we just cared about getting our fruit and our so forth we talked about. And so we get this, then there's this fight back and forth. So I really believe that you're exactly right. I love what you're saying. It's really a multi-dimensional problem that can't be probably fixed. You agree with this just by putting a wall or even changing some of the laws on immigration, do you think?
Absolutely. There's so much research that shows just enforcing the border or even making migration itself a more painful, arduous experience is not enough to deter
Can't be any
people.
worse, if you ask me. Can't be any worse, even if you're
Right,
doing it correctly.
right. And it's one of the things I talk about in the book, that it isn't just the material condition that drives children or anyone else to migrate unauthorized, but it is the emotional, like kids talk about, even in the US, and when I'm interviewing them in LA, young people are telling me, I remember my mom crying. I remember my siblings being hungry. I remember the feeling of like guilt, shame, sadness from seeing my family suffering. So it
Okay, how about
isn't
this?
like, yeah.
My question has to deal with what's really happening on the ground today. We have all these immigrants coming. We have people coming to the border and saying, look, a political asylum or whatever. And if they, I've done political asylum trials. If they get to trial under the current law, they're going to be deported. These are children that may, let's say they're not born here. They come here young, but they speak English. They don't know any other real place. And now they're really in jeopardy of being deported back, aren't they, still today? So maybe there's a sibling that is born here, they'll stay, but the other child has to be sent back to a country they don't know anything about. Is that still happening as far as you understand? And
Yeah, there is a growing body of work now on US born children that are de facto deported because their undocumented parents were deported, or mixed status families have to end up dealing with the fallout of the one person that is being targeted for deportation. It isn't just you pluck them out and then the rest of the family stays the same, especially because it's typically men, and
the money.
men are being targeted for deportation. So, what is left of the children, or the wife maybe that was a homemaker or gets paid less in the labor market? So the family ends up leaving. So US born children are being deported, right, by
Well, how
virtue of
about,
the US immigration law.
I don't think a lot about this, but if you deport the dad, kids are born, a couple of kids are born here. I know, for example, I know a person waiting 12 years now for the political asylum trial. Miami, of course, because that's where, it's in Minnesota, it'd be a lot quicker. And they've had a sibling born, in the States, right? So during the process of waiting to find out if they're going to stay here or not, I just wonder, how's this going to affect all these kids that, the government or the people have to pay if they do stay. I mean, if you left a parent here who's working and bringing in income and supporting the family, you take that guy out or that person out, now the family has to look for assistance. And that child that was born here is going to qualify for assistance, right? Because they're US citizens. That must put a bigger burden, rather than if we just deported, the breadwinner of the family, we'd be less stress on our tax system or our social system. Do you think that
Yeah.
argument makes any sense to you or not? I mean, I'm curious.
Yeah, it does make some sense to think that the US born individuals that are left behind would need some kind of social safety net to rely on, right? And that might put a greater strain than if you leave a breadwinner ahead of household, regardless of legal status. And there is work that shows that people do not want to be undocumented immigrants, or most people do not want to rely on these
Government.
government assistance, because of the stigma that And for the undocumented population or people in mixed status families, the fear of being called a public charge, right? Being called reliant on the US government, and that therefore might risk deportation or family separation.
Why do these parents allow their children to go? It can't just be the material issue. What is the outcome they're more worried about of them staying with the parent, that the parent is willing to let them go?
I'm losing track of which group we're talking about.
I thought the unaccompanied minors that we were.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So you're talking about children who are pre-migration, though?
Well, I'm sorry. I apologize. We were talking about the material situation these young people are leaving, where they were doing child labor and stuff like that. But the parents, as they watch them go away, they must fear the outcome of if they stayed more than the outcome of trying to get to the U.S. by themselves.
Yeah. So in the case of the unaccompanied youth that I did my research with, what I found is that parents were concerned also with the material future of young people, but also socially, young people's ability to be functioning adults in a society that offers no opportunities for integration or mobility there. So in the case where children had supportive parents in the origin country, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, or Mexico, in the case of my research, parents and children typically made those negotiations side by side. But there was also the cases where children had fragmented relationships with their families. Either parents split and they went their separate ways and the kid was kind of left alone, or caregivers were persecuted and there was no one left in the family to take care of the child. Or in some cases, I talk about a few young people who experienced domestic violence and they migrated to get away from the parent. So there are situations where parents and children can collaborate in making the migration decision for the child, or a child independently makes a decision to leave their family or community because of the sort of circumstances there.
In Los Angeles, in California, is it a state that an undocumented person can get a driver's license?
Yes.
Okay, I think there are 15 states in the country, Florida, the South, forget it. And I find it interesting when I've done cases with people that I say, why do you live here? Why don't you just move to a state that at least you can get your driver's license? Because we've seen people deported for no valid driver's license and all kinds of weird things that in California they would laugh at. Here it's worse, I promise you, the things we've seen with immigrant families. But they don't seem to want to. They want to stay with their family. They want to, you know,
Yeah.
I'm just curious that if your work, I know you did the research in Los Angeles, have you done that beyond the city of LA or beyond the state of California in some of your look-see at your topic and
Yeah.
these children?
Sin Padres, Sin Papeles is based entirely in Los Angeles, California. And I will say that even when asking young people why they chose to migrate there, they weren't saying things like driver's like anything. Children, undocumented children get health insurance. Like that's not what they're thinking about, because they're not really making decisions based on state, regional, county level policies, right? They're thinking, who do I know? What reference point? Maybe it was a Facebook photo. Like what point of familiarity might I have? Many of the young people that I interviewed for my research had a long settled relative living in Los Angeles. And I talk about how the poverty or the undocumented status or the family dynamics of the long settled relative often made it the case that they couldn't take the child in. So not only did the child migrate unaccompanied, but they stayed unaccompanied as they were coming of age. I've since finishing this book, have started research in the state of Texas as sort of a comparative case. And it's the same thing, you know, like people, what you were saying, that the family, they have a connection there. They know about a job or a factory that maybe the name is familiar. So they're not really people are not making everyday migration decisions based on what the state context might be, right? Because then Texas would not be the state people would go to, but it's the state receiving the highest number of unaccompanied children.
Doctora Canizales, we don't have much time, and I wish we did, but let's say you do run, you're a United States Senator, you're a Congresswoman. And now you have this problem before you. I found it's easy to, and I'm not speaking about you, but it's easy to criticize the people in power. I know people that have criticized government, they get elected and they don't do any better. What policies, what do you think resolves these complex issues? Where should we be going as the Congress? And I know we haven't passed laws since Reagan, since the 80s for immigration, and they had a bipartisan bill, the Senate did, and Trump squashed immediately. And we it's not the president's job. I think even Barack Obama struggled. I was there a little bit, and as a lawyer, and Barack Obama, can legally the president do what he did? The answer is no, in our opinions, but he had to do it because, I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis. A lot of legal scholars would say the president doesn't have that power. It's really Congress. So what would you do? How can we start to resolve these problems that you found through your research?
Yeah, it's hard. I almost can sympathize with politicians that get to positions of power and then you realize the systems are so intertwined. It's almost like how do you detangle a lot of these things? But something that I've tried to communicate to students or to anyone that's interested in advocating or working alongside unaccompanied children is that we can focus on forming new programs. There's the Unaccompanied Children's Post-Release Integration Program in the US, post-release services. We can make those systems more robust, right? Unaccompanied children are in some ways similar to foster youth. So we can focus on, and that benefits US born kids, right? We can focus on really refining that system of care because we know it fails a lot of children, regardless of immigration status. We should invest in education and newcomer schools and counselors for newly arrived students. That benefits US born children too, right? There are ways that we can really start to get at creating that safety net, as you mentioned very early on in our conversation. Instead of punishing people for the circumstances that they're living, we should really create a system of support and care. But to the main point, I think I'm reminded of really early on into the Biden administration, they set out to understand the root causes of child migration and Central American migration, which is where this conversation started, right? So I think if we want to get at solutions to the crisis as a whole, it means taking on the origin of the crisis, which is US intervention in the region, right? Once children have left, it is our responsibility to create a space where children are safe here. But if the point is to stop child migration or to slow it, right? Because we're getting almost 150,000 children every year since 2021. We need to really go to the root of it and address the issues in the origin countries. And that often means giving power back to the community, not finding more ways to be involved and get our sticky paws
As a
involved.
professor, one of the things anyway that I've always promoted, I found Unidos now to get Latino kids, the young people into universities with the hope. And, the word I love in Spanish is oración. It means prayer, orar con acción, prayer with action. So I can't say to people, so instead of the church is full of people praying for immigration, we're praying for change, praying for that. Ask God, if you're a person of faith, for the strength for you to make the change, right? So do you do that in the university? I mean, how do we get, in this case, I think it was Malcolm X was talking to a progressive white chick once, I should say chick, but young lady that was saying, how can I help? And he said, you can't. Civil rights is a black issue, meaning that it takes not progressive whites to change it, but blacks to change it. Equally, it doesn't take progressive whites to change so much of the immigration system. They do have a big part on it, but it takes Latino leadership in our community. Lots of Mexicanos, lots of Latinos. I don't see any leaders except for one, which is not much of a leader, Marco Rubio, but we don't see Latinos, Latinas taking charge and owning the day politically and making the moves that need to see the change. And a lot of them that do, there's an expression from Colombia, my wife's Colombian, she said, blue-eyed Colombians. They come here and they think that they're white. The Mexicans are the same thing, or whatever group they come from. My cousins who are more white than anybody, but they're 100% Hispanic. They become blue-eyed, whatever, and they don't contribute. They don't change. They don't work for immigration reform. They don't do the things that you're talking about. Isn't it, in a way, a reflection against the Latinos who are not doing enough, or you disagree with that?
I will respectfully disagree. I think what we have seen structurally in terms of the Latino community is the way racism and oppression, systems of oppression and disempowerment work. We have seen generationally blocks to mobility. There's work now on the second and third generation Mexican, US-born Mexican children of undocumented Mexican immigrants who were beneficiaries of the last amnesty decades ago, right? And their starting point was being undocumented low-wage workers. So their children or their grandchildren are now going to college and they're achieving this mobility. So when our starting point is really delayed, when Central Americans are not acknowledged as refugees in the US and they're starting as these criminalized undocumented people,
Right.
It takes the second and third generation, me and my children, right, that will be then in universities, be professors, maybe be politicians. So I think we're delayed in our starting point because of immigration policy, because of structures of disempowerment.
You're in a unfortunately we gotta go, but you're in a very progressive state. People in my side, on the right side, which is not the right side, meaning right wing, DeSantisville, they don't look at California in a favorable way. They'll say that they're spending taxpayer money. Your programs that you're pushing are ridiculous. It's not my problem, blah, 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 blah. And I don't buy that policy. That's why I'm hated here. So is it California, or is it, in your opinion, or can you base it off across the country, including the South, that your arguments make sense? But what I tend to see here is that, yeah, they do go to school, but then they're the ones that step on their own race, whereas if you're getting education and you're getting the proper support and you're getting the things that, in my opinion, California provides compared, not enough in your opinion, I'm sure, but compared to Florida, maybe the outcomes pushed quicker or different. I could be totally wrong. What do you say?
I think in that case, we would need to get into a robust conversation about how capitalism and neoliberalism and the sort of
that opens up for me to say that
myth of
maybe you will be able to
meritocracy
come back.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm going to need to come back for that. But I think for the
great.
most
Thank
part,
you.
people
And
are
the book
doing
is currently
their best.
available, correct?
Yes.
Sin
Padres,
Padres,
Papeles is available.
Let's order a bunch of copies.
We'll have the link on
and
the
to
YouTube channel
Unidos,
too.
To Unidos Now, we ought to promote it. It's just a fascinating topic and a subject for you to study and then be the portavoz, the voice of what you've found in your study. Because at the end of the day, I can have an opinion. You got to base it on something, right? And at least you in your field in education are doing that. And by the way, I'll just leave you with this comment for me. I always ask my kids, I say, what are you here to do? What is your goal in this world? I mean, it's not just to make money and eat and have kids, but education and people like you are doing a lot because you're laying that foundation. Even showing up on this little show, maybe you'll touch one or two people that in years will make a huge difference. And being an educator and inspiring young Latino kids and doing all you can is, I want to say you're my hero. So thank you, and keep it up. Make the changes in the world and keep it up. I think when we founded Unidos Now back in the day, the hope was to see somebody like you change the world. So thank you for being on the program.
I appreciate that. That means a lot to me. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me. Sorry, Henry.